The ABC seeks to treat Indigenous cultures and beliefs with respect. To many communities, it is distressful and offensive to depict persons who have died. Indigenous communities which may be offended are warned that the following program may contain such scenes. "100 years ago, our Prime Ministers went to London to guarantee Australia's security. Today, they travel a different route: Beijing, Washington, Tokyo. Australia, over the century, has reinvented its place in the world.
We are neither Asian, nor American, nor European. We go to the region as Australians. The only way we can go.
I would say a partner, not a family member yet, because it's different, and it'll be a long time before it becomes a family member.
At Federation, Australia feared Asia. The instinct for survival was one of the main forces behind nationhood. Australians agonised over how 4 million people could defend their ownership of the island continent.
Our thinking on foreign policy matters from the time of Federation, perhaps even before, up to the conclusion of World War II, was how do you deal with the main threat? The main threat was Japan.
Australia relied upon the might of the British Empire. A strong empire meant a strong Australia. In 1901, Australian troops were already fighting for the Empire in South Africa's Boer War. This war would launch the Great and Powerful Friend tradition. Our forces would be raised at home, sent abroad, and fight on foreign soil. This would become the Australian way of war. But Australia could not depend upon great and powerful friends forever.
Britain was Australia's first great and powerful friend. It was family. Australians felt that their survival depended upon the Empire, and that's why they always went to war for Britain. When Britain was finished as a world power, Australians looked to a new great and powerful friend, the United States. But the days of empire and great and powerful friends are long gone. Australia now accepts responsibility for its own fate. This program is the story of how we came of age.
The rise of Japan shocked Australia. Japan's 1905 war victory over Russia made it dominant in the Western Pacific.
The 1905 Russo-Japanese War was extremely important for Japan because it established Japan as a great power in the region by defeating a white European power. And from that time onwards, Japan became a credible threat to other powers in the region.
Japan had become Britain's main ally in Asia. But
Australia was suspicious of this alliance and worried about Britain's reliability. Australia's security depended on the Royal Navy.
Japan has ulterior motives. Her policy can be summed up in one word: expansion. Japan looks abroad. Japan has no love to the white man, not even of a British ally. The Lone Hand, October the 1st, 1908.
Australian leaders took bold action to strengthen the young nation. On Christmas Day 1907, Prime Minister Alfred Deakin invited President Teddy Roosevelt's American fleet to visit Australia. Eight months later, the greatest ever fleet of 16 battleships, all painted white as a symbol of peace, sailed through Sydney Heads. Australians were ecstatic.
Fleet-titis is raging all over the Antipodes just now. All Australia is jumping mad in its delight. On every point, there seemed to be a band playing the Star-Spangled Banner. And it lasted an entire week.
Deakin's motive was fear of Japan.
The visit of the United States fleet is universally popular here. Not so much because of our blood affection to the Americans, but because of our distrust of the yellow race in the North Pacific.
Deakin was the first Prime Minister wanting Australia to have two great and powerful friends. Yet Deakin knew that Australia also had to help herself.
We saw in that period before the First World War two strands of Australian defence policy that have existed throughout the whole century, and that is the strand of being part of the empire, the imperialist strand, if you like, and at the same time one that was then in those days called the Australianist view. That is, we should defend Australia from within Australia.
By 1911, Australians were cheering the creation of their own navy. It was just in time. The outbreak of World War I in 1914 saw Australia's ultimate sacrifice for a great and powerful friend. Britain would not have a more loyal ally.
I want to make it quite clear that all our resources in Australia are in the Empire and for the Empire, and for the preservation and the security of the Empire. Prime Minister Cook.
Australia's first action was in the Pacific. Rabaul, the capital of German New Guinea, was seized by Australian forces. Japan was our war ally. When Australian troops sailed to the Middle East en route to Gallipoli, they were escorted by a Japanese cruiser. The little digger, William Morris Hughes, Prime Minister from 1915, never trusted Japan. He knew that Australia's security was tied to the fate of the Empire.
It is to me quite clear that in the event of even a temporary reverse to the Allies, the Japanese government might not be able, even if they so desired, to keep Japan behind Britain.
Hughes saw that we needed to play our part in the empire, but also had his eye on the fact that the quid pro quo for that is that the empire would be expected to help defend us in our area of the world. And he had a suspicion of Japan before the First World War, which continued during that war, even though Japan was our ally.
The Great War was fought in the trenches of Europe. Official war photographer Frank Hurley documented the carnage.
Every 20 paces or less lay a body, some frightfully mutilated, without legs, arms and heads, and half covered in mud and slime. God knows how those red-tabbed blighters at headquarters, 60 miles from the front, expect our men to gain such a strong position when they have to drag themselves through mud. Curse them.
The Australians rallied. They were in the forefront of the great Allied counteroffensive of 1918, which ended the war.
Australia played a very major part in 1918, one of the few occasions in which a large Australian army has taken on perhaps one of the best armies in the world, the German army, the main enemy in the main theatre, and defeated it.
Australia's sacrifice in the Great War had been immense. 59,000 dead. In a population of 4 million, nearly 420,000 men had enlisted. Billy Hughes would now invoke this blood sacrifice. His opportunity came at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference. World leaders gathered to decide the fate of defeated Germany and its colonies. The key figure was US President Wilson, who dreamt of creating a new international body, the League of Nations.
He is great on great principles. As to their application, he is so much like Alice in Wonderland. Give him a League of Nations, and he will give us all the rest. Billy Hughes.
Hughes had contempt for Wilson's dreams. At the sumptuous Quai d'Orsay, a clash was looming between Wilson and Hughes over who would control German New Guinea. Wilson wanted the new League of Nations to have ultimate responsibility for the former German colony.
There must be a League of Nations, and they could not return to the status quo. The League of Nations would be a laughing stock if we were not invested with this quality of trusteeship.
Hughes rejected this. He was insistent that Australia must annex the former German colony.
Australia had suffered 90,000 casualties in this war and lost 60,000 killed. The islands were as necessary to Australia as water to a city. If there were at the very door of Australia a potential or actual enemy, Australia could not feel safe.
Britain's Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, watched the clash between the two men.
Mr. Hughes listened intently with his hand cupped around his neck. The President asked him slowly and solemnly
that if the whole civilized world asks Australia to agree to a mandate in respect of these islands, Australia is prepared still to defy the appeal of the whole civilized world.
Mr. Hughes answered,
That's about the size of it, President Wilson.
But a compromise was agreed. Lloyd George forced Hughes to abandon annexation and accept a trustee system where New Guinea was administered by Australia. As for Wilson, his own Congress vetoed US participation in the League of Nations. Billy Hughes had doggedly pushed Australia's interests. He had won concessions from the great and powerful, a strategy the future Prime Ministers would follow.
Our first duty as Australians is to Australia, to its interests, primary and secondary. But our next duty is to Britain, upon whose strength and power our safety and progress depend.
After the Great War, the world was a more dangerous place for Australia. The British Empire was weaker, and Japan would become an enemy. Australia was still dependent upon the Empire, and Britain pledged to make Singapore a naval fortress, a pledge it never properly honoured. Singapore would become the grand illusion of Australian defence policy for the next 20 years. Australia was trapped, too weak to defend itself, but hostage to an empire too weak to control the Pacific.
In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria. Its atrocities in China reinforced Australia's deepest fears. During the 1930s, Australia's defences were unprepared.
Everyone prays that peaceful councils may prevail amongst the nations, but we realise also that the greatest hope for world peace lies in the united and strong British Commonwealth of Nations.
Its leaders followed Britain's appeasement policy and relied upon Singapore, Britain's naval base in the Far East.
Australia did indulge in a great deal of self-delusion over the whole Singapore issue. If you go back into British official records in the 1930s, on Singapore, you can see there are various marginal notes, do not pass this information on to the Australians. The British themselves had a fair idea that the policy was not going to work if it came under real pressure from the Japanese.
In September 1939, World War II began. Once again, the Empire was under threat.
We can't be beaten except by ourselves.
Prime Minister Robert Menzies dispatched troops to the Middle East to assist Britain's war against Hitler. But this war was different. Australia's own security was at risk. Menzies knew that Australia faced a direct threat from Japan.
This is not 1914, when land forces in Europe were the determining factor. In this war, Australia's own security must be attended to.
Menzies wanted Britain to reinforce the shaky Singapore fortress. In early 1941, he left for England. Welcomed by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Menzies was both impressed and repelled.
The cabinet is deplorable. Dumb men, most of whom disagree with Winston, but none of whom dare to say so. The chiefs of staff are without exception yes men. Winston is a dictator. He cannot be overruled.
When Menzies arrived in London, he got a nasty surprise in respect of what he expected to get from Churchill. He was hoping to get support, forces to be sent to the Far East, and what he found is that Churchill wasn't interested in the Far East, that Churchill was interested in fighting the war in the Middle East, and that he really didn't have his mind focused on the Far East.
Churchill was friendly, but he told Menzies, "I think Australia will have to be mauled a little." Menzies came home empty-handed. The empire was overstretched. He soon lost the support of his own party. Labour's John Curtin became the new Prime Minister. Curtin was an idealist and a socialist. As a prominent anti-conscriptionist, he had been jailed briefly during World War I.
Comrade Curtin is a revolutionary, every inch of him. And though still on the sunny side of 30, one of the finest platform men in Australia. Bob Ross, journalist.
He was a man of very considerable courage, both in the conduct of his personal life. He was an alcoholic. He gave that up to equip himself to discharge the duties of leadership of the party and then of the nation in the most effective possible way.
On the 7th of December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Australia's 50-year-old nightmare became a reality: war with Japan. The war would force Australia to think more independently and assertively. Curtin, Prime Minister for just 8 weeks, moved to rally the nation.
This wanton act of sheer aggression involves the people of this Commonwealth as nothing that has ever happened in our history involved us. We are face to face with the struggle for sheer existence.
It was a war on two fronts. Allies were at war with Germany and Japan. Churchill and US President Franklin Roosevelt had a beat Hitler first strategy. The war against Japan would be secondary. Australia felt weak and naked. 3 of the 4 AIF divisions were in the Middle East and North Africa. The 8th Division was under siege in Malaya. On Christmas Eve, Australia's representative in Singapore, V.G. Bowden, cabled,
"As things stand at present, the fall of Singapore is, to my mind, only a matter of weeks. If Singapore and the AIF in Malaya are to be saved, there must be very radical and effective action immediately."
It was too late for Singapore to be reinforced. Curtin now went public with his most famous appeal, splashed across the Melbourne Herald.
"I make it quite clear that Australia looks to America, free of any pangs as to our traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. We shall exert all our energies towards the shaping of a plan, with the United States as its keystone, which will give to our country some confidence to be able to hold out."
In Washington, President Roosevelt was unimpressed. He summoned the Australian minister, Richard Casey.
If it was thought that this statement would ingratiate Australia with the United States, I assure you it would have the opposite effect. It tasted of panic and disloyalty.
But it was an article addressed primarily to the Australian people. And what he was saying was, we need new friends, we need to think anew strategically, and don't think that you're actually going to be able to have anything done by simply relying on someone else. You've got to get off your backsides and do the job yourselves.
Singapore fell on the 15th of February, 1942. For Australia, it was the worst disaster of the war. The 15,000 men of the 8th Division became prisoners of war. A third would not survive.
I saw them fight and get routed, and I watched them march into captivity for one whole day and I think 2 nights across my front porch. But it was a traumatic experience, I mean, one which shaped my generation. I mean, I saw the Japanese as conquerors, brutal, ruthless, totally devoid of human pity.
Empire protection, upon which Australia had relied since 1788, was finished. Australia had been deluding itself for too long.
We went along with the Singapore strategy, and if we're to blame Britain, we equally must blame ourselves for going along with that strategy. So I wouldn't use the term betrayal to describe what happened with Singapore.
Days after the fall of Singapore, the Japanese bombed Darwin. "243 dead, 350 wounded, 6 ships lost."
In Darwin and at the airbase nearby, there was panic. I'm just old enough to remember the tremendous shock to public opinion. I was living in Melbourne at the time, and people were talking about packing school children off to the country as refugees and so on. We dug air raid shelters in our back gardens. It certainly hit public opinion hard.
Curtin now faced his most important decision. Australian troops in the Middle East were being transferred to the Pacific. The chiefs of staff insisted that they be brought home. Curtin cabled Churchill.
If possible, all Australian forces now under orders to transfer to the Far East from the Middle East should be diverted to Australia.
But Churchill wanted to use the Australians to reinforce Burma against Japanese attack. He took an extraordinary decision. On the 20th of February 1942, Churchill unilaterally ordered the convoy carrying the Australian troops to change course and steam north to Burma. He then tried to intimidate Curtin into agreeing.
I am quite sure that if you refuse to allow your troops to stop this gap, a very grave effect
will be produced upon the President and the Washington Circle, on who you are so largely dependent. We must have an answer immediately.
Churchill did not tell Curtin that he had already diverted the convoy. Roosevelt backed Churchill in a cable to Curtin.
I want to ask you, in the interests of our whole war effort, if you will order the division now en route to Australia to move with all speed to support the British forces fighting in Burma.
The opposition leaders, including Menzies and Billy Hughes, said Curtin should bow to Churchill. The Chief of the General Staff, General Vernon Sturdy, threatened resignation if the troops were not returned.
This was essential to our survival, in a physical sense, as an independent nation. It was also essential to demonstrate to the UK and the US that Australia should not be taken for granted.
Curtin again told Churchill that the troops must return. Churchill kept up his intimidation.
We could not contemplate that you would refuse our request, and that of the President of the United States, for the diversion of the leading division to save the situation in Burma. We therefore decided the convoy should be temporarily diverted.
Curtin was appalled to discover only now that Churchill had diverted the troops.
Pressure from Churchill on Curtin at the time of the argument over the withdrawal of Australian troops from the Middle East was the most intense that any Australian Prime Minister has ever been subject to by an ally in any circumstances in the nation's history.
Curtin was shaken and went for a long walk before replying.
We feel a primary obligation to save Australia, not only for itself, but to preserve it as a base for the development of the war against Japan. It is quite impossible to reverse a decision which we made.
Curtin finally got his way.
Yes, it's Ozzy. The AIF is coming home.
Curtin was right on this issue. I don't think there's any question about it. Had those troops been diverted to Burma, they would have arrived in a situation where they could not have been fighting, they were not loaded properly, and almost certainly they would have gone into prisoner of war camps in Burma, and they would not have been available for the defence of New Guinea later that year.
1 month later, Curtin's ambition for a deep Australian-American collaboration was realised. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Melbourne. He had been ordered to Australia by President Roosevelt after the fall of the Philippines. MacArthur's arrival restored Australia's battered morale.
No general can make something out of nothing. My success or failure will depend primarily upon the resources which the respective governments place at my disposal. In any event, I shall do my best.
MacArthur went to Canberra to meet Curtin. It would be a unique partnership. Curtin, the humble anti-militarist, and MacArthur, the self-styled man of destiny. At midnight on the 18th of April 1942, under a directive agreed by Curtin and Roosevelt, MacArthur, a foreign general, took control of all combat units of the Australian Armed Forces. Curtin gave up a measure of sovereignty in the cause of survival.
You have come to Australia to lead a crusade. at the request of a sovereign nation. You are being placed in supreme command of its Navy, Army and Air Force.
Japan decided to isolate Australia rather than launch an invasion. Australia's fate was secured by the naval battles at the Coral Sea and Midway. They halted 6 months of Japanese victories. Japan was forced into a land battle for New Guinea, a battle it would lose.
I see the battles fought by the Australians in New Guinea in 1942 as the most important ever fought by Australians in relationship to the direct security of Australia. If we had not fought those battles successfully, Australia would have been under threat, certainly of attack and perhaps of invasion.
Curtin died on the 5th of July, 1945. The war was won, but he did not live to see the victory. The Prime Minister was a war casualty. Made America a new, great and powerful friend. But it did not create a new alliance. That would take another event.
I don't think a great deal of what they did was because they sought to save Australia. They recognised that Australia was a very useful base to have on the flank of their advance, and they did what they had to do to secure that base. But if there had not been those other interests, I don't think the Americans would have been terribly interested in Australia's future.
Contrary to popular myth, John Curtin in World War II did not create the American alliance. The alliance was created by the Menzies government and the Cold War of the 1950s. The Cold War involved a new global struggle between democracy and communism. It lasted for half a century. It meant that America was looking for allies around the world, and Australia seized its chance to create a new, great and powerful friend.
Communism was on the march. The Soviet Union had taken control of Eastern Europe. Mao Zedong had seized power in China in 1949. There were fears of a new world war. In June 1950, communist North Korea launched an attack on South Korea. The United States under President Truman led the defense of South Korea.
Today in Australia, Reds openly preach their gospel, flout our laws, and form a growing menace to the future of this country.
In Australia, the new Liberal government, led by Robert Menzies, was staunchly anti-communist. Its foreign minister, Percy Spender, now saw a golden opportunity.
He saw the power shift that had taken place as a result of the Second War, and that Britain would never again be the same, and that for all of the past and the history and the tradition, our future lay in alliance terms with the United States, and the United States would be the dominant power.
Spender wanted an Australian troop commitment to Korea, but Menzies followed Britain's line and was against sending troops. Spender lobbied hard.
Any additional aid we can give to the US now, small though it may be, will repay us in the future 100-fold. My personal view is that we must scrape the bucket to see what we can give.
On the 26th of July, 1950, Spender was staying at Mossvale when he learnt that Britain had changed its mind. It was about to commit troops to South Korea's defense. With Menzies overseas on the Atlantic Ocean en route to America, Spender decided that Australia must commit its troops before Britain.
Spender thought that if the United States saw Australia simply following in Britain's wake, Australia would get no credit at all in the power struggle in Washington. If Australia could get ahead of Britain and appear to be the most supportive member of the Commonwealth, that would really register in the State Department, Pentagon, and the White House.
Spender prevailed. The decision to commit troops was announced that evening on the ABC.
This is the ABC broadcasting through national, regional, and local.
Breaking the news to Menzies on the Queen Mary was the hardest part.
I told Menzies on the transatlantic phone of the decision. He was obviously put out. He said little, but even over the distance of some 12,000 miles, I was aware of the sourness in his voice.
For Australia, Korea was a political war, a modest military commitment to win the support of a great power.
Australia contributed forces to Korea for its own diplomatic reasons, not through a sense that it was our duty to protect the people of Korea. I think that should be said candidly.
Spender's campaign succeeded. In 1951, the United States had wanted to make Japan a Cold War ally. They sent U.S. envoy John Foster Dulles to Canberra. But Spender demanded a price, an alliance with the United States in return for Australia's support for the Japan Treaty. The deal was done. The ANZUS Treaty was signed at San Francisco on the 1st of September 1951.
And now Percy Spender, Australian ambassador, signs for his nation.
Australia had exploited the Cold War crisis to win a new great and powerful friend, the United States.
Menzies dismissed the whole idea as unachievable and told Percy Spender a couple of times that he was chasing a will-o'-the-wisp. But once the actual form of the treaty had been hammered out in legal terms, then Menzies picked it up with true political brilliance and played it as if it was his own treaty.
The Japan Peace Treaty meant that Japan, the old enemy, would become a new friend. The next step was to make it an economic ally. The architect was Menzies' trade minister, John Blackjack McEwen. In 1957, he negotiated the Australia-Japan Commerce Treaty, which tied Australia into Japan's miracle economy.
There was an occasion in the government party room when somebody got up and said, "We don't need this trade treaty. We have our great and powerful friends." And Blackjack was enraged by this comment. He jumped to his feet and he said, "And that is just the problem, because our great and powerful friends do this to us." And he went through item after item of importance to Australia, which America would not buy, or Britain would not buy, or certainly wouldn't buy if they went into the European Economic Community. And as we know, McEwen won the day.
But the threat from communism only intensified. In Vietnam, in Malaya, and in Indonesia, where the radical nationalist President Sukarno was in power.
For Australia, up until late 64, even early 1965, by far the biggest problem in the region was not Vietnam. It was Indonesia's confrontation of Malaysia.
The Menzies government wanted US support in any showdown with Indonesia. It asked Washington whether the ANZUS Treaty would apply in this situation.
The Americans hedged their answers to that. The answer was, our assistance to you over Indonesia is related to your assistance to us elsewhere. And it was pretty clear that by elsewhere, the Americans were meaning Vietnam. So the two were linked.
America's primary concern in Asia was Vietnam. It feared a domino effect originating with China.
South Vietnam went, it would not only give them an improved geographic position for a guerrilla assault on Malaya, but would also give the impression that the wave of the future in Southeast Asia was China and the communists.
Australia saw Vietnam as a political opportunity. It was a way of making a small military commitment to keep the US involved in Asia.
The problem of Vietnam is one, it seems, where we could, without a disproportionate expenditure, pick up a lot of credit with the United States. For this problem is one to which the United States is deeply committed. Alan Renouf, Washington Embassy.
On the 29th of April 1965, Menzies announced what would be Australia's largest military commitment outside the two world wars. It was driven by fear of Chinese communism.
Does anybody with his five wits doubt that before very long, Chinese communism, acting through North Vietnamese communism, would sweep down through South Vietnam, would put itself in an early position to control Thailand, to render the position of Malaya almost intolerable? Yep. We would find ourselves with aggressive communism almost on our shores, just across the water from us.
The prime motive for Australia's involvement in Vietnam was to anchor the United States more firmly in terms of a security commitment to Southeast Asia. That was the region from which Australia saw trouble coming, but the United States, on the whole, despite the ANZUS Treaty, had not really been seriously involved.
For the first time, Australia was fighting a war without Britain. Britain was already withdrawing from Asia. Harold Holt, who succeeded Menzies in 1966, was the champion of the Vietnam commitment. On the White House lawn, he declared his faith.
I hope there will be a corner of your mind and heart which takes cheer from the fact that you have an admiring friend, a staunch friend, that will be all the way with LBJ.
Harold Holt was never really all the way with LBJ, except in the sense that Australia was really operating within a framework that it had operated for at least a decade and a half. That is, of giving very strong political support, strong diplomatic support, strong public rhetorical support to its great and powerful friends. In Vietnam, as previously in Malaya and Malaysia, but only supplying relatively small military forces.
The Labour Party fought the commitment. The nation was soon divided.
A vote for conscription on Saturday is a blood vote.
Conscripts were being sent to Vietnam. Opposition to the war mounted in the United States and Australia. 50,000 Australians served in the war and 501 were killed. Western intervention in Vietnam failed and the war was lost.
How I see it now is second-guessing how I saw it then. I thought it was necessary. I thought what we did was defensible. But judging it all by today, and judging some of the things that I now know about the United States conduct of the war, I guess I wish we weren't part of it.
The great and powerful friends now redefined their role in Asia.
The American involvement in Vietnam is coming to an end.
Under President Nixon, the United States left Vietnam. In 1973, Britain joined the European community. Australia had to rethink its place in the world.
The Vietnam failure did lead to a greater maturity in Australian foreign policy. There's no question about that. We were instructed to develop that maturity, I might say, by the United States. A seminal influence upon the getting of maturity for Australians was President Nixon's Guam Doctrine, which was that the United States, like the Lord, helps those who help themselves.
Australia was in a new era. The symbolic proof of its growing maturity was the recasting of China from an enemy into a friend. This was led by Gough Whitlam, who visited China in 1971.
It was a very hazardous thing. Santa Maria said I would be the Manchurian candidate for the Prime Ministership of Australia. And our own Prime Minister, Billy McMahon, said that Joanne Lai was playing me like a trout. But in fact, of course, it came off pretty well.
Knowing of President Nixon's. Good evening, Ross Simons in Sydney. The announcement that President Nixon is to visit China has taken the world by surprise.
Within days of Whitlam visiting Beijing, US President Nixon announced that he too would visit China. Shortly after winning the 1972 election, Whitlam established diplomatic relations with China. The China relationship now became the foundation for a new Australian policy.
I wanted Australians to get to know Chinese people. I wanted Chinese to get to know Australia. So enmeshment simply was interconnection in so many ways, but not just economic.
By the 1990s, Hawke's successor, Paul Keating, had taken the policy to a deeper level, engagement with Asia.
I believed that at the end of the Cold War, all of Australia's vital interests coalesced in Asia. Trade, security, cultural. That if we put the question in the negative, do we have vital interests in Africa? The answer is no. Do we have vital interests in South America? No. Do we have vital interests in North America? Some. Where do we have our vital interests? Where we live, in Asia.
But engagement with Asia would be more difficult than it seemed. For 30 years, Prime Ministers from Whitlam to Howard pursued close relations with Suharto's Indonesia. But Australia and Indonesia fell out in 1999 after the East Timorese voted for independence and Australia led the UN force to restore order.
The whole East Timor issue was the most important foreign policy challenge that I've had as Prime Minister. And it was a very important moment in our relations with the region. It was difficult. it did require us at a critical juncture to really press the case with the government of Indonesia and to play a very active role on a broader world stage in getting the coalition together.
This crisis was a reminder that while Australia is geographically located in Asia, it is not an Asian country.
Your economic ties have increased, your political ties have increased, but to be part of the family, you must develop the social side, the people-to-people side, and that's been limited.
One 100 years after Federation, Australia has embarked on an ambitious task, integrating its new ties with Asia with its old friends in Europe and America. The sun has set on the old age of great and powerful friends.
Australia once relied upon its great and powerful friends for its protection and for something more, to help it define its place in the world. This was never a one-way street. As our story shows, Australia exploited and managed the friends just as much as they exploited and managed us. Australia now is an independent, multicultural nation. Asia is not a threat, but an opportunity. Australia has redefined its role in the world. It accepts responsibility for its own fate, the real test of national maturity.
That was the final of 100 Years, the Australian Story. You can find the video and book from the series at ABC shops and centres. And if you're on the net, you can now discuss the issues from tonight's programme with Paul Kelly and other participants by visiting the website via ABC Online. Just go to abc.net.au/100 years. In a moment, a look at living with dinosaurs for next week. Then stay with us for Foreign Correspondent.